Therein lies our problem with the CS for Defense, Honorable Aden Duale. Because you will remember, he issued that gazette notice on an evening without the approval of the National Assembly. The following morning, very early, the National Assembly convened, and within 30 minutes, they had discussed that request and approved, whereas the gazette notice, had been gazetted a day earlier. So it was a case of shooting first and then aiming later. And that is where our problem is, despite also having an issue with the substance of that deployment, because that deployment ought to be done within the confine of the law, and there has to be a reason. Is it that the National Police Service has failed? Is it that we are in a state of emergency? Is a scenario that is ensuing right now within the country, does it really deserve the deployment of the Kenya Defence Forces? Those are the questions we are waiting for the court to rule on.
Yeah, and the court papers faulted the state for failing to demonstrate that the National Police have been overwhelmed or are incapable of dealing with any peaceful protests. And from the Tuesday pictures that we saw, there was an element of destruction of property when you looked at City Hall being on fire, yes. The Parliament also, sections of Parliament being destroyed. The Senate and what have you, the Supreme Court as well. In terms of the police's ability to control that, when we talk about persons losing their lives as well as destruction of property, surely visually somebody could have argued that in fact the police seemed to have been overwhelmed. Well,
it's a proper argument, Lillian, but we have to contextualize this debate and this whole scenario, because what has been happening with the protesters and the police and the claim that the police have been overwhelmed, I don't think, in my view, warrants the KDF. For this reason, the protests, even though they were widespread, we didn't see the magnitude of destruction of property, loss of lives, and unruliness that would warrant the deployment of the KDF. The reason is, unless the government is telling us that they have lost faith in the National Police Service and they are incapable, we shouldn't deploy the KDF. For the simple reason that the Kenya Defence Forces are not trained to deal with civilians. They are purposely trained to deal with external forces who are a threat to the sovereignty of our nation. Therein, Lillian, when the Cabinet Secretary issued that gazette notice, he never bothered to explain the reasons. The National Assembly, further, and these are some of the reasons why we read mischief. The National Assembly and its proceedings, they were not public.
Yeah.
There has been no communication as to the reasons why that decision was taken and as to why the request was made. The CS has not told the country through the National Assembly that we have been overwhelmed, so we can just guess ourselves. He has not told the country through the National Assembly that the situation as it is so grievous and dangerous that if we don't involve the KDF, we are going to slide into anarchy. They have not done that.
And what about the Ministry of Defence's counsel, terming these chaos as characteristic of something that has been experienced in the country before, and that this situation falls squarely in a situation of emergency, that in such a state of emergency, this kind of deployment has in fact been done before. So this is not a unique case where, for instance, the Ministry of Defense has had to come out and pull such a move.
I think, Lillian, there is some dishonesty with the Ministry of Defense and the government at large, the executive arm. Because when such a scenario happens, there is no need of secrecy. We are living in this nation unless something has happened outside what we have been seeing, or unless there is something that we are not being told. There has been no reason of requesting or even deploying the KDF.
Right.
And what happened, maybe they think in their wisdom was so much is maybe the occupation of the National Assembly by protesters on Tuesday. And whereas that has never happened in this country, where such an institution has been occupied by protesters, the government should also ask themselves, how did this happen? How did we get here? And after asking that question, because the government and at large the executive specifically, they had the benefit of intelligence, of National Intelligence Service. They ought to have known this would happen. And it is not actually a matter of National Intelligence Service, Lillian, because it was actually in the public domain. Everybody was saying, there was actually a hashtag Occupy State House. So therefore, the government knew that these people are actually intending to finally reach State House. But they ought to tell us, is the National Police Service incapable? Were they overwhelmed? That is the actual thing that they need to tell us.
Right. And, the High Court has certified this as urgent, this petition filed by the Law Society of Kenya. We are still waiting to hear what exactly the ruling on this issue is. But in terms of the LSK's argument that the country may be receding into a police state, in layman's language, elaborate to us what that translates into.
We are actually fearing that we would say in terms of percentage, 40% we are almost a police state. The reason I am saying that before I explain what that is, the government, or through the Cabinet Secretary for Defense, did actually deploy the military. And we have actually seen them today in the streets. At some point they were at Nyayo National Stadium. At some point they actually made their way into the city and they made rounds. I don't know whether they are back or whether they are waiting for the ruling by Justice Mugambi. But a police state is not something that any Kenyan or even the president or leaders would wish that we have. Because in a police state, normally, there are some rights that normally are suspended. You remember when areas like Boni Forest, when terrorism was so much alive, the government would issue curfew. And it would issue curfew from this period to this period. You're not supposed to be outside. From this period to this period, you're supposed to be within your estate. And a police state would be so grievous such that if we slide there, we would not maybe be able to bounce back socially, politically, and even economically, because businesses will be closed and we will only be opened when government says and when government wants. And then you may find some police officers or security officers taking advantage of that. The criminals also, they may also want to take advantage of that, because at that time several things are suspended. The police are normally outside walking all over. You will be frisked. Even if you are not necessarily frisked, people will be asked for their IDs. You'll be asked where you're going, where you're moving from, and therefore our right to movement will also maybe be crippled a little bit. Yes.
Now, it's generally acknowledged that the military are not professionally trained in dealing with internal security matters which involve civilians. And what we're seeing is that even as they do their rounds, there's a general sense that there's a heavy military presence. Going by what this ruling, decides as regards the military's involvement or lack of it thereof. Let's look at those two scenarios. Let's begin with the military's involvement in quelling, the violence or controlling the protests that are now countrywide, as you can see. In terms of how far, who is their central point of command in such a case? You're saying that indeed a police state would then mean that movement is controlled. Perhaps there would be a curfew therein. So in terms of the military's involvement in all of this, what are the extreme cases that are likely to be experienced in such a case, and who then would be the central point of command that would put an end to all of this?
Yes, Lillian, actually that is the question that the LSK also is asking the court. Is asking the Cabinet Secretary for Defense, and we are waiting for Justice Mugabe to rule, because as I have said, when the cabinet secretary is requesting for approval of deployment of the KDF, it is normally not just for the sake of it. It is normally something that is thought through. The National Security Council, I believe, have to sit and they have to see this area at this time and for this period of time has to be deployed with Kenya Defence Forces. Now, we are in a quagmire and we actually don't know when the Kenya Defence Forces personnel land into our streets and they fight the National Police Service personnel, who is going to lead the other? I mean, the National Police Service might want to say we have been leading this, we are on this, and therefore we know what we are doing. Secondly, the Kenya Defence Forces might come and say we are the big brothers, we are going to do this, we have come to reinforce, you guys have actually been unable. And therefore, you will remember a while back when we had a situation at Westgate.
Yes.
When the Kenya Defence Forces were deployed there, and there was actually a problem with the then leadership of the police service and the KDF, because, and actually people have later on argued that there might have been some mishaps that made that scenario worse for lack of leadership. And therefore, the failures that are being created by the cabinet secretary for defense might actually be felt harder when the defense forces get into the streets, because they cannot get into the streets without a structure. And if they get out without a structure, be sure that the situation will be more messed up than they have found it, because first they will have a commotion or a mishap within themselves, whereas they are supposed to be on the streets together to safeguard life and protect property.
All right, and we're looking at pictures from different parts of the country as anti-finance bill protests continue. You will remember that as of yesterday, President William Ruto declined to sign the Finance Bill 2024 and also proposed a raft of amendments to the bill, which MPs will now have to consider. And in returning the bill, the president will point out key areas that need to be altered. And we're looking at what the president said in a televised address from State House, Nairobi yesterday, where he said he had listened to the views of Kenyans. The president pointed out that he would go by the wishes of the people. But even after that, we still continue to see protests underway in parts of the country. We're getting pictures to you from Migori, Makueni, Mombasa, and even here in Nairobi County, where sections of roads in the city have been barricaded, heavy security presence in major roads as protesters continue to demonstrate in parts of the country, albeit peacefully. We are seeing heavy security presence, roads barricaded, motorists being turned